Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this live kitchen cabinet with two fantastic experts, Alejandra Castillo, who is the president of YWCA USA, and Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, who is the Democracy Initiative and Racial Justice Project Officer, Director of Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Both longtime allies of Vote Run Lead and both absolute geniuses and experts on what we're going to be talking about today. My name is Erin Velarde. I'm the founder of VRL, and this is part of a larger project where we have been talking about radical leaders who are uncovering our past to build us the democracy we deserve, a series we've been running online on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. Yesterday, we talked a lot about sort of citizenship and who counts and who matters. We looked back at Japanese internment and concentration camps. We talked about Black Americans during Reconstruction. And there are so many parallels to what's happening today. There are so many parallels about who gets to count. And the topic of the census and redistricting and how we count our citizens, who counts as a citizen, and where resources go is extremely critical. So we have just 30 minutes here, folks. We are going to dive in, and I am going to open up with you, Alejandra, in what is the status of Census 2020 right now? Why is it important? But really, what's happening in the moment?
Sure. So, Erin, I am a huge fan of yours. Whenever you call, it's like, that bat signal that I just respond immediately because I follow you. I believe in your leadership and your vision. So a couple of things. One is I am a fan of the census for so many reasons. I do recognize that the census did not start out with a racial justice lens, because even though it's incorporated in our Constitution, not every human being was counted as a complete human being, which is important to note. But today, the census is the most important instrument that we have in our nation, and we have to really honor it for two reasons. One is it's the way our government distributes money. Right. It's also the way our government distributes power. And those two things, especially for communities of color, is monumental. So right now, the census is behind, not only traditionally, but it's behind in its count of where it was in 2010. And that is monumental because, as a dear friend of mine, Maria Teresa Kumar, has put it, when you do an undercount of a child, it means that the desk that child will need when they have to go to kindergarten will not be there. So I want to really make a public appeal that if you haven't filled out your census, you must. The census is also forward thinking. So it's not just who is existing today, but it goes into projections. And that's why it's always so important to be mindful of how we're doing the census. So again, there's a traditional undercount when it comes to communities of color, when it comes to women and children under 4. So again, I can't stress enough why it's important for women, communities of color, and for the country as a whole.
And how's the YW pushing this out, right? Particularly to those populations and aligned with your mission of eliminating racism and empowering women.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, when I started at the YWCA as CEO, I came in very passionate about the census. So as you can imagine, remember, there was an attempt to suppress the count by this administration as it related to people with mixed status, immigration status. Right. And the census says nothing about immigration status at all. And it was ruled that was not going to happen. But there has been an attempt over and over again to create that sense of doubt, planting that seed of doubt, planting that seed of fear to make people not fill it out. So here's what we're doing at the YWCA. One is we're speaking loud and we're speaking to everyone who comes through our doors of how important the census is and how it impacts them. Individual, how it is important to them. And second of all, we're making sure that we make it accessible, because as you know, this is really the first time that the census is digital. So making sure that people can come through our doors, fill it out. But in this moment of social distancing, it's just making sure that people can go back if they have a computer at home, fill it out. It only takes 10 minutes if at all. So just being the voice of the community and making sure that people understand why it's important.
Yeah. And Keesha, as a longtime expert of democratic reform, democratic practice, where are we in comparison to 2010 with and what have been some of the effects of this suppression on the numbers?
Sure. So we are way behind. We're about, I think we're doing a little better. We might be up to 52, 53% of respondents that we had at the same time in the 2010 census. And this is a combination of factors. It is some of it is a pandemic response, but there's a huge issue and a huge question around the behavior of this particular administration to politicize the census and to really make it part of a partisan agenda in a way that it should never be. And I think we've already heard a ton of the reasons why it's important for everyone. And historically, that has always been the way we've approached the census.
Right.
Everyone's here, get everyone counted. And the politicization and oftentimes the racist nature of what happens throughout the census can show up in all kinds of ways. And leveraging these tactics has been really, really disappointing, but we've seen a lot of that. There's been a delay in the field strategy, right, to get actually enumerators out on the doors because of safety and what that is looking like. And they're just starting to figure out how to roll that out and how to get people to knock on doors and still be safe about that. While at the same time, we've got the administration engaging in really questionable policing tactics that make it very scary to have somebody you don't know knocking on your door. So there's all kinds of a political context that's really challenging our ability to get the count right. So those are some of the issues and some of the questions I think we're seeing right now within the census. So there's a lot there.
Well, and I think one of the things you're both hitting on is like just putting it in the air, right? Around the fear of filling it out, the fear of somebody coming at your door. I had a girlfriend of mine put on Facebook, like, I'm not filling this thing out. They're trying to like kind of get me. And I was like, don't worry, the squad helped to like smash that, like that question, the sort of status question. So what are some of the ways that what are some of the messages you've both been seeing that have been effective to debunking some of those myths and to demystifying some of those fears?
Some of the messaging that we've seen that has been the most effective has really been about community counts. Yeah. And that's for everybody, right? Yeah. Everybody really being known that's like, this is how you get your representation. This is how resources show up in your community. And if you're not counted, the resources don't show up. Correct. And that really has had cross-racial effects for positive, even more than some of the pro-government messages that maybe sometimes, we in the democracy field like to think should work more. The one message that has been really most effective in responses has been, your community matters and you matter. Getting counted and every single person getting counted is what you have to do. And then just reminding people that affirmative responses means nobody comes to your door. Correct. Like if you actually take care of it yourself, the government doesn't show up. Just just fill out the form online. If you don't have online access, you can still get a paper form, but you can request one and however it works for you. But if you do it affirmatively, no one's going to show up. Get counted. Take care of it. If you need help from your community, you can get help. And really looking to organizations like the YWCA and many others that have really worked to get their facilities and their chapters and their folks in the field to really be able to connect one-on-one with community as trusted messengers around this work. And that has been essential, as near as we can tell, to actually get the most responsive feedback at such a critical time.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add in, Erin, and just to underscore what Keesha has been saying, we can intellectualize it and be all the way up here, but people live in the heart, right? They live in terms of what matters to them. So as Keesha said, when you make it and you bring it home and you say, look, that 4-year-old child may not have a desk, or that elderly person may not have the services that they need, or you may not have the workforce development that you need. When you bring that message home, that's what motivates people to fill out the census, to register to vote, to cast their vote. Or when you say, hey, by the way, your representative has done well for you, but guess what? If you don't vote, if you don't fill out your census, that district may disappear because you may lose 3 members of Congress. You got to bring it home. The message has to bring home. You can't live up here. And that sometimes as organizations, we have to live in the communities that we serve. And that's why for the YWCA, we live and breathe the communities that we serve. And it's, it's a lot of fun, because when you deliver the message and people, you see their eyes light up and they're like, oh, now I get it. That's powerful. That's really powerful.
And you don't have to be, signed up with the YW. You guys have great resources online that can just empower individuals to say, I'm going to get 10 people counted this week. I'm going to get 5 of my closest friends and make sure they filled out the census. Yeah.
And I'll just add again, because, when we are talking about racial justice, this is a racial justice issue. This is a racial justice issue, but because when we're talking about how our government distributes resources, we want fair and equitable. And we want to be visible. We want to be seen. And there's no better tool than the census than to be able to say, hey, we're right here. We live here. We work here. We go to school here. Resources must come here. I think, to me, I feel very passionate that these are the type of policies that are critical to dismantling the type of systemic racism and to really reallocate resources across communities of color.
Thank you. And for those of you who are watching, let's put some questions in the chat. I just want to start to collect those for our experts, Alejandra Castillo of the YWCA and Keesha Gaskins of Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I mean, Keesha, she
not to get too heady about it. I would love to piggyback on the point that these census numbers are also used for economic projections, for research, and all the research that's done to say, look, there's disproportionate impact on communities, this, that, and the other. All the baseline numbers come from the census. So when someone says, oh, Berkeley said this or Harvard said that, those numbers, they didn't count those people. They went to the census to get those numbers. Right. So everything we use to examine the equity of society, examine these impacts, all flow from the data that's collected through the census.
Correct.
That's really critical. I'm glad you said that. I want to also hit back on Alejandra's point around, hey, you're congressional representative, right? And so this combination today, we want to be talking about the census and redistricting, right? And I think so many more people, at least in my community, are more tuned into some of the reforms, some of the structural reforms, right, that hold these systems in place right now. So talk to us a little bit, Keesha, about the connection between census and redistricting and that importance.
Sure. So when they do the census counts, one thing that is used for is for apportionment. So they take those numbers, they break it down and figure out how many people per congressional district, et cetera, and then those congressional districts are reallocated back to each state by population. And so if we don't participate in the census, that means there's actually fewer people counted in that state. But in fact, there's more people represented. So then you have an underrepresentation problem, right? So if you have a state next door to you that participated effectively and they got a 1-to-1 representation and you didn't, that means there's like twice as many people packed into this district that actually have representation. It also tends to geographically expand the space. So then you also have challenges with local representation questions. Oftentimes the state also uses these numbers for questions of representation. And so there are all kinds of questions. Like, this is the way you determine what your districts are, how many your districts are, how large your districts are. That's it. And that is defined by statute and by constitution. And those numbers come from the Census Bureau. They're delivered to the president and then distributed to the states for them to create the districts for which we actually have our representation. And that's how we have our voice. That is the only way in a representative democracy we're heard, through the lawmaking process. So
can I would like to then take the storyline that Keesha is laying out, because as we prepare for this upcoming election, many people are focusing on the presidential ticket, which is important, but there are the next level down, which is your governor and your state representative, is equally as important, because these are the individuals who in this term and the next term will be deciding those electoral maps.
Right.
So you want to make sure that not only are you paying attention as to what's happening at the federal level, but you also want to make sure that you're paying attention to what's happening at the state level, because it is those individuals that you're electing into office who will determine these maps. And we don't have enough time to go into all the challenges that happen at the state level with the electoral maps in terms of redistricting and all everything else. But it's worthy of a conversation, because again, It is how do we make sure that representation coincides with not only reflecting individuals who support the values and vision and of a community. So listen, at the end of the day, elections matter.
Yeah.
And being counted matter. And we need to be seen and to be heard by our elected officials.
Well, and we're seeing
that there aren't really do-overs. I think the one thing that's important to remember is this is done every 10 years and once every 10 years. And that is how political power is locked in for that decade. So even if you're sitting here in this moment saying, oh, well, we're going to see trends, and you've got all the pundits on TV saying over time we're going to see these districts are going to be drawn, and they're going to be drawn by who's in power. And if we're not first electing the right people to draw these lines and engaging with them and going to the public hearings and working on the public engagement strategies, which we can talk about if you want, but there are ways to engage in the process, or are ways to make the process more accessible. That being said, it's a one-time shot for a decade.
Keesha, you gave us the tweetable moment. There are not any do-overs. That's the tweet of the day. Yeah.
This isn't going to happen. We're not going to get another bite at that apple.
Correct.
So we there's been some memos coming out. There's been the blue, I'll call it, coming out of the administration. Keesha, do you want to give us some insights into that?
Sure. I'm sure people have heard a lot of chatter about the administration and this memo that the president just wrote. And it's been misreported a lot. I love my friends in the media, but every so often we have some mixed messages. And they keep saying, oh, this is about the census. It's about the census. Nothing in the memo actually changes the process of the census. Nothing in the memo has anything to do with people's status. It has nothing to do with their ability to be counted. So there's no change in that. Everything we said about the census is true and remains true. What this does is once everyone is counted, the president wants to take out undocumented persons from the total count before those numbers are delivered to the states. And so therefore, as we talked about, this is how we figure out how well the people are and how many people are there, he wants to subtract everyone that isn't documented before the district lines can be drawn, forcing the states to then draw the district lines without representation for those people. And you will see disproportionate problems in all kinds of places. And certainly you'll see it in blue places like New York, but you're going to see it in red places like Texas. You're going to see it all over the country and in regions where there's just going to be massive asymmetry around representation. How are people able to access the polls? What does that mean? And ultimately, how are you represented in policy measures? So this particular memo, which has already drawn a number of lawsuits, is sincerely problematic. And it actually undermines the quality of representation and undermines our democracy in a really deep way.
Yep. And our Constitution says every person shall be counted.
Right.
It never said it never indicated status. It never indicated anything else. So yeah, a lot of issues of constitutionality. So I'm sure there's a lot of
representation is deeper than just voters and citizens.
Right.
We all know that who exists and who lives in our community, how they speak. We don't limit to who can show up to a town hall. We don't limit who can show up to engage. We don't limit all these things. And this matters for representation. Right? Voting is reflective in a very specific way because the Constitution requires it. And, we won't get into that right now here either. But the issue here is that's not the limits to our democratic participation. That's not the limits to who we are as communities. That's not the limit to who we are and who matters. Everyone in our community matters. Everyone in our community counts. We know that it matters how many children are in communities. We know it matters how many people are working. We know it matters how many people are working and how much they make. And we don't need more disproportionate representation where it's more narrowed around people with high resources, more narrowed in a way that's actually not reflective of what people need and how elected officials respond to them. Vote Run Lead has worked so hard to train candidates to get people who care deeply about how they represent community, who care deeply about how they're in space. And the idea that you would look at a community and start picking and choosing who is deserving of representation and letting politicians choose not only their voters, but who they even have to talk to. It's a offensive. And it's really something that undermines what we're actually trying to accomplish to get to a democracy that has always been promised but never achieved. And this is absolutely the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And you know what I find surprising is in an era of data, you know, we talk about big data and how data is important, and we embrace data on so many levels, except when it comes to the census. The census is our tool to make better policy. It's the tool to make a more informed decision. It's our tool so that our decision makers and elected officials can actually be responsive to community. And then we're going to take the same tool and clamp down on it and be able and pick and choose, as Keesha said. This is counterintuitive. It's like it goes against everything we embrace. So again, it is one of those moments that you just scratch your head and you're like, what are we doing?
Well, I think part of it is, you know, it's by design, right? I mean, if we've been doing this sort of history lesson at Vote Run Lead, there's a long history in the United States with the 3/5 clause about who gets to count, right, in America. And so there's been some really eye-opening moments about how the intentionality over time to, you know, decide who counts and who doesn't, which I think knowing more of that, I think gets me, you know, more fired up and getting counted on the census. But I think you've got our viewers also fired up. So I
just want to share one thing in that there is a role for public voice here, that these aren't all technical machinations that we're like, oh, participate and you'll be fine. Like the kinds of political gamesmanship we're seeing right now around both the census and what will flow into redistricting, there is a public voice. You do have to speak out about what is fair and what you want to see. In 1920, the Congress rejected the census, right? Because they actually didn't like how many migrants from Europe were showing up on the census numbers. And they said, no, we're not going to use those. We're going to go back to the 2010 numbers, just because they didn't like it. And the fact is, that's not acceptable. So we have to recognize that while these are bureaucratic processes that we want to participate in, how they're used, how they're not used, how we engage with the public, these are all still issues of responsiveness and representation. And we should be elevating our voices around what we find acceptable and what not, because there's a lot of people that want to play political games with these numbers. They know what it means to distribute power. They know what it means to take that power away, and they know what it means to undermine that power. And we must continue to speak up. We have to stand on these issues. This is not just a question of fill out the form. Please fill out the form. This is not just a question of, this is a matter of representation, and this is a matter of how we are heard.
Right. So how can we do that? How can our viewers do that? How can we get the Vote Run Lead community activated, Alejandra? What can we do?
You know, first of all, as Keesha said, fill out your form. Make sure you fill out your form, your family, your cousins, your neighbors, everybody. You should be the ambassador of making sure everybody fills out the form. Second of all, I always say, look, you have a powerful tool. You know, you can be engaged in social media conversations, making sure your voices are heard, making sure that people understand the importance of this. And then also, as was mentioned, raising the concern that this is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. We have to make sure that this is unacceptable and that we're going to raise our voices every single day, relentlessly. Because as again, that tweetable moment, we only get one bite at this apple. If not, we live with these numbers for 10 years, whether they're accurate, inaccurate, undercount, or no undercount. And that has tremendous repercussions. So I invite everybody, again, in the spirit of John Lewis, let's make some good trouble here, because this is the moment for us to really raise our voices and say, this is unacceptable. We deserve better.
And what's, okay, we have a question. And then this is also a part of, you can answer this, Keesha, in what we can do, right, in talking to undocumented community members. Can you clarify what the census means for those who are undocumented?
Oh, okay. So the census is a private collection of data. We're simply counting the number of people who are here. That information is not transmitted to law enforcement. That information is not transmitted to other places or spaces under law. But it does mean, for those who are undocumented, you still count. Yeah. You're still using hospitals, still sending child to school, right, still paying taxes, still doing all the things that matter about being a part of a community. And this is an opportunity to be counted. And I don't want to overstate the census is absolutely and has always been safe, but I also don't want to understate it. This is a really tough messaging point, and I'm challenged around it. And but the fact is, it is as a technical matter a safe and legal process that is not used in any way for law enforcement, and it is there to design and count who we are.
Yeah, but as and I'm just going to chime in, as Keesha said, by law, personal identifiable information is not, the government cannot share that information with law enforcement. It cannot. So again, it's a sensitive conversation because again, we have a current government that unfortunately is pushing the boundaries, but from a legal perspective, we have legal defense organizations that are making sure that does not happen. But it is where the census is where, whether you're undocumented or not, it is your voice to be able to be seen. And I use the word to be seen because, you know, in Spanish, hacerte contar means to be counted, but to also be recognized. And I use as somebody who comes from a Latinx background, it's important to be counted as to be valued. And that's why I'm so passionate about this conversation.
Thank you.
And I want to lean into that value piece. Because I think one of the things we're challenged most by is we keep elevating, like, we want you to be seen for populations who spend a lot of time striving really hard to be unseen. Yeah. Like, that's actually a goal. And so I think while we talk about, it isn't just about being seen, but it's about being valued and recognizing that everything you give and participate in community needs to be recognized, needs to be acknowledged, and needs to be part of the social and political infrastructure for where we live and how we live. And the census is actually the government mechanism to ensuring that. And so it is really almost just as much about value and valuing who you are and your contributions and the membership in community in a numeric way, which I realize isn't everything, but it is something that's very important when we think about what it means to bring resources to places.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I feel like there's like 5 more things I want to get to. Yeah. I know. What are some of the trusted resources? You know, so many women in the vote community are ambassadors. I'm going to commit that from today until next Friday, and I will email you both. I'm going to get 10 people counted who I have in my mind of who's not actually being counted. So I'm going to do my 10, and I'm going to start shooting for 10 a week. Evangeline actually helped us fill it out, so that was fun. She drew all over the paper once, so we went online and did it. But I'm going to get 10 people. What other resources? So folks are fired up. They're hearing you all, but they may have a few more questions. What are trusted resources?
Our legal defense funds, that includes ACLU, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, many of those organizations, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, all these legal structures and spaces. Also look to spaces, and I'll let Alejandra talk to the YWCA, which I love, in terms of the resources that are offered by community organizations, but who will also help you fill out your forms, help you get connected to resources, in language assistance for all of this work. The information is published in many, many languages, and there are organizations that have actually expanded language access for where you are. So I would say check your community organizations. If you have legal questions, go to the websites of the legal defense funds.
Yeah, and similarly in the community-based organizations, obviously YWCA, you can visit our website ywca.org. But you know, National Urban League, Unidos US, there are a lot of nonprofit organizations across the country who are doing great work on the ground, making sure that communities know where the resources are in language, culturally sensitive, and you know, at the end of the day, the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau has put together a very, very robust set of information that people can go and access in terms of language sensitive as well. So, you know, just take the moment, fill it out. If you have questions, reach out to us, and also be a voice and raise your voices as well.
Great. Thank you. So here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing, of course, get counted if you haven't. You know, be that amplifier in maybe your social media pages, putting this stuff out, contacting folks in your community who you need to get counted in your close network, and maybe even take it one step further by volunteering or, you know, seeing how else you could get involved to, you know, especially if you're healthy enough, if there's some things to do outdoors, farmers markets, that kind of stuff. We're seeing it here in New York City, where it's tough to go door to door, right? It's tough to do that ground game. So get creative about how you can share the census, which is digital for the first time. As Keesha shared, we're about halfway about where we need to be for Census 2020. And both Alejandra and Keesha, thank you. You did a beautiful job of outlining why it's critically important for all of us, but especially for our communities of color, and really rethinking and redesigning our democracy.
Beautiful. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much.
You both. I love you both so much.
Love you too. Bye there.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Wednesday, 1 o'clock for the next kitchen cabinet. Wednesday, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Head over to voterunlead.org/events to check it all out.